Uh, Good evening and welcome to the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library. My name is Mariana Wertzman and I'm a librarian here at the World Languages Department on the fourth floor. First and foremost, I would like to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for making this program possible. In addition, I would like to remind you that if you don't already have a library card, one of my colleagues can assist you with getting one. We have a wonderful lineup of events that is coming up in the next several months, so please register at the nypl.org and look for events. Tonight's program is about a subject that's of vital importance to all New Yorkers. It's housing. The Projects: A New History of Public Housing is written by Howard A. Husock. Howard is a senior fellow in domestic policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute and the author of many other books, including American Trillion-Dollar Housing Policy Mistake, The Failure of American Housing Policy, The Poor Side of Town, and Why We Need It, Who Killed Civil Society, and a number of others. Howard has received many awards for his work as a documentary film producer, including the Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award, the National News and Documentary Emmy Award, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting Award. His writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Wall Street Journal, and many of the other leading publications. Without further ado, please welcome Howard Husock.
We may have a microphone malfunction. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mariana. It's a privilege and an honor to be speaking at the New York Public Library, where I spent so much time in your research archives, including for this book, including for a new book I'm writing on the history of American foundations. And to go to that reading room and immerse oneself in the files that are archived in this library, it's like entering a time machine, and it's a marvelous opportunity. So it's really a great privilege to be here. As Mariana said, public housing and housing policy generally is not a side topic in New York City. It's central to our discussions about public policy forever, constantly, and currently. When we talk about public housing, it's important to know we have so much more public housing than the rest of the United States. It's uncommon in most places. There are in the whole United States 860,000 public housing apartments, 860,000. In New York City alone, there are 177,000 on 332 different locations. Now, to put this in perspective, there are 3,200 local public housing authorities. That means that many of them have very small numbers of apartments, in contrast to the New York City Housing Authority, which is a giant among housing authorities. And so the history of public housing is very much the history of public housing in New York. And indeed, public housing was born here. And I'm going to talk about how that happened. I was inspired to write this book in order to find the answer to what for me was kind of a mystery. Not why public housing is not in the best of shape today, although we could do better, certainly. I will discuss that. Not why public housing became the locus of poverty, although that concerns me. The question that inspired the book is more fundamental. Why did public housing in America happen in the first place? After all, publicly owned, government-owned and operated housing is just quite fundamentally different than any other American housing type. Even Franklin Roosevelt said he believed this is a nation of small homeowners, even though he signed the first legislation creating public housing. In a country where private enterprise is both the norm in terms of developing housing and is generally celebrated, public housing projects were built, owned and managed by government, by local authorities. In a country that encourages and celebrates home ownership, public housing offers no ownership possibilities. In a country where ranch houses and big yards on small cul-de-sacs in suburban areas are kind of iconic, the classic image of public housing is that of a tower in the park. And we can see that all around New York. For instance, at the Stanley Isaacs projects, 3 23-story towers in Yorkville. The Brownsville housing projects, the Queensbridge housing projects, the largest today in the United States. High-rise buildings in campuses without any local streets. Just a very different model than most of the country. There have been a number of previous books and a number of documentary films about the conditions of public housing. I would refer you to one called Public Housing by the recently deceased celebrated filmmaker Frederick Wiseman, called Public Housing. It includes exposés about the maintenance, about crime, about how it might have been made to work better. My motivation was different. In light of how out of character public housing is for America, my question remains, why and how did public housing happen in the first place? And why has it proved to be troubled? Those are the questions that drive my book and drive my story. So I was surprised as I began to dig in to the archives, including archives here, and at the Wagner LaGuardia archives in Queens, where all of the files of the New York City Housing Authority are stored. My research led me quickly to an unexpected starting point, New York's Museum of Modern Art. It was there in October 1934 that saw the opening of what was blandly called the Housing Exhibition of the City of New York. This was no ordinary art show. It did not feature paintings from the past, no Picasso, no Caravaggio, not even the more modern artists, as you would think at MoMA. It presented rather a vision of the urban future. Photographs of so-called slum conditions on the city's Lower East Side. Let's see what we got here. We got no photographs. Where are they?
You're holding, it's upside down. This is to go forward.
Okay, good.
Mm-hmm.
This was the housing exhibition of the city of New York in 1934. And you can see on the lower right, there's the tenements of the Lower East Side on a poster meant to show their degradation. This was a model apartment in the housing exhibition, courtesy of Macy's, which undoubtedly planned to furnish the new public housing. And this was a book that was part of the exhibition. These were the slums. This was the future. And this was the future as it turned out to be. High-rise towers in the park. This groundbreaking vision of public housing as a kind of public utility to be built and run by experts, a housing authority, was justified and described in detail by a companion book, America Can't Have Housing, meaning that the housing system of private enterprise just didn't work. It made the case in a series of essays by leading intellectuals of the era that spelled out their assumptions. The city and much of the country's working class was confined to neighborhoods that were labeled as slums. Sunless, crowded, disease-ridden tenements those were the best that private housing builders were ever going to provide. And the solution to cross out these slums required unprecedented government intervention. First, slum clearance, meaning the demolition of large neighborhoods. Hundreds of thousands of people were displaced. And the construction of new government-owned and operated public housing of an entirely new kind, a via radiante, or beautiful city, made of apartment buildings on green campuses. Like this one in Vienna. That was one of their models. The goal of this vision for a new type of housing and a new type of city was a better life for those of low income. But it's important to know this was not, my research showed, a grassroots movement. The slum residents were not clamoring to have their slums demolished. They were not consulted as to whether they disliked the neighborhoods where they lived and wanted public housing to replace them. The committee that oversaw the housing exhibition did not include them at all. Rather, it was sponsored by the leading lights of New York society, including philanthropist Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, Arthur Oakes Sulzberger, the owner of the New York Times, the wife of leading New York attorney Joseph Proskauer, New York Governor Herbert Lehman, and Secretary of Labor Francis Perkins. It was, to understate New York's elite, included the architect Philip Johnson, who would become later a leader in modernist design. The key essay in the exhibition book was authored by Catherine Bauer, a Vassar College graduate and city planning enthusiast with no experience either in government or in the housing industry. During the 1920s, she had spent time in Paris, where she had fallen under the influence of the Swiss futurist Le Corbusier, a key figure in the public housing and modern architecture movement. He conceived of housing set off from city streets. In fact, he dreamed of a city without streets. And we have those campuses all over New York. If you walk up Broadway and you cross the Broadway Bridge from Manhattan to the Bronx, you'll see long rows of stores, apartments with stores on the ground floor. And then you come to the public housing projects, and there are no stores. There's a gap in the teeth. That was by design. We were going to have a city without streets, no way to cut through. The streets that used to be there were dead-ended. That was the design, a city without streets. Catherine Bauer wrote, "The old measures of providing shelter for people of average income or less are today so thoroughly unworkable or obsolete that any attempt to solve the housing problem can only be achieved by drastic measures. Modern housing," and that would be the title of her influential book, released in 1936, quote, "means complete new communities planned entirely from the point of view of the fullest usefulness and long-time amenity, instead of chaotic subdivision and speculative profits. It means that rentals must be geared to the capacity to pay and not to the market." Rhetoric that still sounds attractive. One can imagine our mayor saying that today. It means that a decent dwelling, she continued, is not a reward withheld for the successful, but a fundamental right to which every citizen is entitled, the provision of which becomes the responsibility of government. Almost every intelligent technician or social worker, she said, would agree with these premises. The social critic Lewis Mumford was even more blunt. In attempting to make better standards available for lower income groups housed in crowded tenements and dark hovels, it becomes plain that no effective work could be done as long as capitalist canons of enterprise continued. This was socialism, government ownership of housing, and it happened. And so was the groundwork laid for the passage just 3 years after this housing exhibition. I love the housing exhibition. I wish they would restage it. That the National Housing Act of 1937, the first federal public housing legislation, was passed. Catherine Bauer herself went from designing this exhibit to helping to draft the legislation for New York Senator Robert Wagner. President Franklin Roosevelt himself saw the U.S. as what he would call a nation of homeowners, But in the depths of the Depression, he was persuaded that public housing construction would jumpstart the building industry and create union jobs. Not a small matter for Senator Wagner, who of course sponsored the Wagner Act to legalize organized labor and collective bargaining. The federal government would assist local housing authorities, that was a new innovation in government, in slum clearance and financing construction along the lines envisioned at the Museum of Modern Art. In New York, the head of the Slum Clearance Committee would be, does anybody want to guess? Robert Moses. Not only was he building bridges, not only was he building the Cross Bronx Expressway, not only was he building parks and beaches, he was building public housing all across New York. He oversaw the relocation of hundreds of thousands of residents, at one point reaching the demolition of 60 buildings a month. Indeed, in the exhibition book, again, slum residents not consulted. Should we tear down your building? There was only one essay in the housing exhibition book which discussed a survey of Philadelphia tenants asked about their interest in replacing living in row houses with high-rise apartments living. They were negative. But it went ahead anyhow. The impact of the housing exhibition and those associated with would be dramatic with the subsequent passage of the National Housing Act. The faces of cities across the country, not just New York, but especially New York, would be permanently changed. Not only would high-rises go up in Philadelphia, Chicago, and St. Louis. Let's go to that St. Louis high-rise. No, it's not there. This is a set of high-rises in Boston. So again, no streets, diagonally built, no cut-throughs. Public housing campuses would be built in hundreds of small towns, including in the Deep South, a concession to Senator Henry Stegall of Alabama, who objected to tax monies being used only for big cities. It was a great boon to segregation because mixed-race neighborhoods in the South were demolished and replaced with single-race public housing. When Franklin Roosevelt dedicated the first public housing, the Techwood homes in Atlanta, it was all white. When Eleanor Roosevelt dedicated the Companion University homes, it was all black. Public housing was segregated housing. One of the major contributors to the housing exhibit, Edith Elmer Wood, was a Columbia University faculty member. She lived in Gramercy Park herself. She was dispatched across the country to make decisions about which neighborhoods were slums and should be demolished. It's interesting to note that of all the neighborhoods that were demolished across the country in slum clearance, 43% were black. Black people have never made up 43% of the United States population. Black neighborhoods per se were deemed to be slums because they were black. To forge ahead with their modern housing vision, these progressive reformers had to overlook a great deal. Bauer and Mumford may have been certain that the private market was failing those of modest incomes, but across the country, prior to the Depression, what we might call today affordable housing had actually been going up at a large scale. In Philadelphia, between 1880 and 1930, private enterprise built 299,000 individually owned small row houses that could be afforded by working families. In Boston, 15,000 three families went up, housing for 60,000 people because each had 3 units. In Brooklyn, 120,000 small buildings were built with apartments on the second and third floor and stores on the first floor. I noticed in his city of yes, former Mayor Adams was talking about bringing back ground floor retail because it brings life to cities. Not there. The pioneer sociologists Robert Woods and Albert Kennedy had published a book in 1915 about these new neighborhoods. They called it the zone of emergence, places to which poor immigrants moved as their fortunes improved. In other words, you could take a snapshot of the Lower East Side, but it was not a static snapshot. By 1930, Lillian Wald, who was the head of the Henry Street Settlement House, was commenting about the fact that there were so many empties in that neighborhood. Why? Because people had moved across the Williamsburg Bridge into new buildings in Williamsburg. At the same time, these reformers had over-dramatized the supposed degradation of the slums. We all know about Jacob Riis. He wrote How the Other Half Lived, the famous expose of tenement conditions on the Lower East Side. His biographer has written, there was actually a lot that Riis overlooked. He was a dramatic photographer, and he found the worst conditions. But there was more to the slum, writes Thomas Buk-Swienty, a Dane himself, just like Riis, and wrote his biography. Hundreds of thousands of families lived relatively normal lives. They worked, they paid rent, they fed their children, and they had hopes and dreams for the future. In fact, I can't help but notice that the Tenement Museum on the Lower East Side refers to its building as the urban log cabin. In other words, a starting point for moving up rather than a dead end, which is what the public housing reformers viewed it as. For a large number of immigrants, wrote Riis's biographer, life in the tenements was an improvement over their old lives in rural Italy, in the shtetls of Europe. What's more, in Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and other cities where slum clearance would occur, many of the neighborhoods that were torn down had significant rates of owner occupancy and also what I call owner presence. In other words, 2, 3, and 4 family buildings where the owner lived and rented out units. These offered owners a means to accumulate wealth. I could talk for a long time, and I'll talk a little bit later about the black-white wealth gap and how public housing contributed to it, because in public housing, there is no ownership. The government owns it. So-called slums were also replete with small businesses. In Detroit, the African-American neighborhood that would be cleared for the segregated Frederick Douglass houses. Just think about that. Frederick Douglass houses was a segregated housing project. What an insult to Frederick Douglass. The ribbon was cut on the Frederick Douglass houses that replaced more than 300 black-owned businesses. In Southwest Washington, the largest slum clearance in the country, there were 1,000 black-owned businesses that were taken for slum clearance. When conservatives say African Americans are not entrepreneurial, right, because their businesses were taken away. None of this context figured at all in the public policy debate about public housing, however, as momentum to build public housing grew following World War II. In amendments to the National Housing Act he signed in 1949, President Truman authorized slum clearance to make way for 800,000 public housing projects. He issued a clarion call endorsement that was in many ways the high point of the public housing movement. Said President Truman, "This far-reaching measure opens up the prospect of decent homes in wholesome surroundings for low-income families now living in the squalor of the slums. It equips the federal government for the first time with effective means for aiding cities in the vital task of clearing slums and rebuilding blighted areas. This act establishes as a national objective the achievement as soon as feasible of a decent home and suitable living environment for every American family and sets forth the policies to be followed in advancing toward that goal. I take deep satisfaction in the successful conclusion of the long fight for this legislation." So just to review what got replaced. This is a neighborhood in St. Louis that was torn down. This is the Hill neighborhood in Pittsburgh. The plays of August Wilson, the accomplished American playwright, probably the greatest American playwright of the 20th century, think Jitney, Fences, all were set in the Hill, where we see street life. No, we're not getting to that yet. Yeah, this is a graphic artist's recreation of a similar neighborhood in Roanoke, Virginia, that was demolished to make way for public housing and highways and office buildings. this artist recreated from his memory the neighborhood of his youth. Whoops. What did I do? I miniaturized everything. I didn't want to do that. Help. That's always the answer. Okay. This is the so-called Black Bottom neighborhood in Detroit. It was named because the soil when the French got to Detroit was very dark. It had nothing to do with race. And you can see there's a well-dressed young mother and a very presentable house. This was the slums. The projects began to go up. Here's Eleanor Roosevelt coming to replace that neighborhood. By the way, Eleanor Roosevelt thought she was being benevolent in creating racially segregated public housing because she said, it's going to be so nice, we don't want to exclude African Americans. We want to make sure we include them. She thought she was benevolent by doing that. This is another picture of the Hill in Pittsburgh, cleared for public housing. This was considered a slum. The projects began to go up all across the country, from Brooklyn to Birmingham, from Philadelphia to St. Louis. It was there in 1953 that the city opened its Pruitt-Igoe houses, designed by the modernist architect Yamasaki. Mr. Yamasaki was quite star-crossed. He also designed the World Trade Center. Its 33 11-story buildings, think about this, 33 11-story buildings, replaced the small homes and businesses of the DeSoto Carr neighborhood. Seen here, including significant employers, a flour milling company, a parish laundry, and the Berea Presbyterian Church that was the first African-American Presbyterian church west of the Mississippi. Slum, torn down. Public housing was in full swing, and at least in its early years, when the buildings were new and there was still a post-war housing shortage, there was a golden age of public housing that I write in the book. It was popular. It was in demand. It was populated by working-class, two-parent families. The New York City Housing Authority insisted that there be two incomes in order to qualify for public housing. Rents were modest, but they were not necessarily ultra-cheap. They were supposed to be the source of revenue to maintain the buildings. Government financing helped to erect the buildings, but it was going to be the rents of the tenants, just as in private housing, that would maintain them. And so it was for a while. But even in what I call public housing's golden age, there were early signs of concern. In Pittsburgh, and we'll go back to, there we are back at the Hill. Well, that's an even, I like that picture even better. I want to move into that neighborhood. It's really great looking. In Pittsburgh, the newspaper columnist Paul Jones, writing for the black weekly The Pittsburgh Courier, wrote critically about public housing even before it was built. In the city's Hill district, he argued that clearance plans had not accounted for the Hill's many community institutions and civil society. Judging a neighborhood narrowly on the basis of its physical character, of its housing, did not convince him it should be demolished. He wrote, "What about the churches, the schools, the business neighborhood associations, the civic groups? All these are part of the whole problem of uprooting the lives of many people whose patterns of living have been labeled not desirable, not acceptable, not endurable." Didn't stop the bulldozers. In the summer of 1956 alone, 1,300 structures in the Hill were razed, displacing 1,500 families and more than 8,000 residents, the great majority of whom were black. Between 1950 and 1990, the Hill lost 71% of its residents, 38,000 individuals, 400 businesses, leaving the neighborhood hollowed out. 5 of the 27 remaining Pittsburgh Housing Authority projects can be found in the remnant of the Hill District. Keep in mind, public housing philosophy excluded retail businesses from public housing, and you don't find it today. A few exceptional pre-1948 housing projects in the city have a few stores. But Robert Moses believed there should be no stores in public housing because he thought those, if we would be subsidizing them somehow and they would compete with private business. So Moses said, no stores in public housing. And what Robert Moses said went. The Hill was representative of a long trend, as I said, black neighborhoods disproportionately labeled as slums and demolished. A National Bureau of Economic Research paper found approved projects cleared or intended to clear of 400,000 housing units, forcing the relocation of over 300,000 families, over half of whom were non-white. By the 1960s, this kind of slum clearance had acquired a sarcastic nickname. In her song, her version of the B.B. King song, Why I Sing the Blues, Aretha Franklin talked about her neighborhood being torn down. She called the process, excuse my language, Negro removal. Her father's church, the Bethel AME, was demolished. That's where she learned to sing, by the way. There's a recording of her at age 13 singing in the new Bethel AME church. I recommend it. Surprisingly, one of the voices sounding the alarm as time went on was actually that of Catherine Bauer, the visionary who had sounded the clarion call for public housing. By 1957, even she had begun to change her mind. She published an essay called The Dreary Deadlock of Public Housing, where she candidly observed that there was growing opposition to the idea and that it had failed, quote, to achieve real popularity with the general run of ordinary citizens and their leaders, and above all with the people who had lived in slums and blighted areas. She wrote this less than a decade after President Truman's enthusiastic endorsement of the public housing slum clearance vision. She compared it notably to Social Security, another key New Deal project which became deeply embedded in American society. Public housing remained a marginal idea. It would be an overstatement to say that we have reached the end of this unlikely story of public housing in America, certainly not in New York, where there remain 177,000 units that need $78.8 billion worth of repairs. In fact, the Community Service Society has described the New York City Housing Authority as the city's largest slumlord. I know and speak with the people who run it. They're trying very hard, and I don't think they should be demonized or criticized. They have a very hard job. We still have 860,000 public housing apartments, although there once were twice as many as that. But the wave that began and crested in 1949 has long ago receded. We have not built nearly any brick and mortar public housing projects since 1973. It was then, just 24 years after President Truman's speech, President Richard Nixon delivered his own address declaring a moratorium on any new public housing construction. He spoke in a nationwide address. Can you imagine that? About public housing. Here's what Nixon said. Federal programs have produced some good housing, but they've also produced some of the worst housing in America. I have seen a number of our public housing projects. Some of them are impressive, but too many, said Nixon, are monstrous, depressing places, run down, overcrowded, crime-ridden, falling apart. The residents of these projects are often strangers to one another, with little sense of belonging to the larger community. And because so many poor people are so heavily concentrated in these projects, they often feel cut off from the mainstream of American life. This is a conservative Republican expressing what I dare say was empathy. The key turning point, not just against public housing, but against the modernist vision it had brought into physical form, had come 3 years earlier in St. Louis. That's when the Pruitt-Igoe project there it is, which in many ways exemplified the modern housing concept. Remember, it had won the Architecture Award in 1952. It was judged to be in such poor repair and so dangerous that it was imploded, blown up in a cloud of dust in an image that went around the world. This was the turning point. It not only exemplified the ideal of public housing, but all that had gone wrong, to the point that the White House, citing it, would call a halt. A serious Harvard sociological study cited by Nixon determined that Pruitt-Igoe itself had become what it was meant to replace. Sociologist Lee Rainwater entitled his study, Behind Ghetto Walls, Black Families in a Federal Slum. Pruitt-Igoe families are those for which our society seems to have no other place. St. Louis residents with the means to do so passed up public housing for new homes in expanding suburbs. Anybody who could get out was moving out. As Rainwater put it, only those who are desperate for housing are willing to live in Pruitt-Igoe. Over half the households are headed by women. Over half derive their principal income from public assistance of one kind or another. And resident interviews recounted the sordid conditions of daily life. There's too much broken glass and trash outside. The elevators are dangerous. The elevators don't stop at every floor. By the way, that was not a bug, it was a feature. They thought people would mingle on the stairways. So people had to walk up or down to get to their apartments. There are mice and cockroaches in the building. The final blow was one which would matter greatly for public housing across the country and matters still today. A rent strike by tenants who were unable to pay what was needed to maintain Pruitt-Igoe inspired a new federal law. Public housing tenants' rent would be limited to 25% of their income. The result, housing authorities across the country would be starved of revenue, and their maintenance would be deferred to the point that in 1992, a congressional report would find that it was common for public housing to be, this is the term the Congress used, severely distressed, a condition which continues in many projects. The New York City Housing Authority, with its 177,000 apartments, is overseen by a federal monitor under court order. It reported in 2019 that the system had endemic problems with lead-based paint hazards, heat and hot water failures, mold, elevator outages, pests, and waste. There's a website that NYCHA helpfully maintains called Service Interruptions. You can look it up every day. Every day there's hot water out somewhere. Every day there's electricity out somewhere. Every day there's gas for gas stoves out somewhere. Not everywhere. The repairs are made, but then the conditions recur. And we know recently at the Mitchell houses in the Bronx, when the boiler to heat the homes in the winter was turned on, it blew up and half of the building was demolished. What's that? Just the chimney. A lot of the apartments were damaged, right? Oh, just the chimney?
The chimney was purposefully built with 6 inches between the building and the chimney, so that if we ever had an escape like the gas escape that we had on that day, only the chimney would be damaged.
Okay, that's good news. Only the chimney blew up. An analysis of New York police data has found that although residents of public housing make up only 4% of the city's population, they account for an estimated 20% of violent crime, prominently shootings, that occur within 100 feet of public housing. In short, I found the answer to my mystery of how public housing happened, and the answer says a great deal about its subsequent transformation into a new kind of poorhouse. From the outset, it was a program born of central planning by social and intellectual leaders, elites if you will, without ties to the communities that they were sure they could improve on, for cities whose character they changed and which remains changed to this day. What they knew for sure is they wouldn't want to live in those poor neighborhoods, so nobody should have to live in those neighborhoods. There's something wrong about them. They're slums. That lesson, of course, transcends public housing. When ideas create programs untethered to practical realities and human behavior and incentives, things can go very wrong. In its own way, public housing was a form of American socialism with its combination of initial allure and long-term trouble. As Jane Jacobs, the Greenwich Village resident who took on Robert Moses successfully, she was the first serious intellectual opponent of public housing in her landmark book, Death and Life of Great American Cities. She said, we should be very worried about plans and places that reflect nobody's plans but the planners. She understood what the Museum of Modern Art did not, that older buildings can be put to good purposes. Can you imagine what those tenements on the Lower East Side would be worth today if they hadn't been torn down. That physical conditions are not the sum total of a neighborhood, that city streets crammed with small shops, industries, and tenements should be celebrated, not disdained and demolished. We continue to play out a long coda to this story. Nixon stopped the construction of new projects and toyed with the idea of simply providing low-income families with an unrestricted negative income tax to devote whatever they thought money should be used for their greatest needs. Incredibly, that turned out to pass the Senate. It was immortalized in a book called Nixon's Good Deed, but it died in the House. Richard Nixon believed in a guaranteed minimum income, and it almost happened. It was going to replace housing assistance. But when that didn't pass, Nixon turned to something else, housing vouchers, Section 8, which now pay low-income families their rent for 1.4 million private apartments. There's no doubt they help some households make ends meet. But they can also encourage poverty and dependency. Those of the lowest income get priority, and besides the poor elderly, they're generally young single parents. They pay only 30% of income in rent, but that means the more income they earn, the higher they rent. Who would sign a lease like that if you had a choice? You earn more, you pay more in rent? But that's what we make as the rule for low-income tenants. Tenants get stuck in this honey trap. More than 89 Section 8 tenants stay 5 years or more, 60% 10 years or more. 10% of New York City public housing residents have lived in their units 40 years or more. Meanwhile, there are long waiting lists. There have been as well a variety of efforts to find a better public housing model, building new types of public housing projects like Hope 6, mixed income. Chicago's high-rises were torn down and replaced with Hope 6 projects. There's some reason to think that they do well at first, but so did public housing. When it was new and in fashion, middle-class families wanted to live in public housing. They're moving in today. Whether they'll stay there, whether they'll continue to be the maintenance income that was deprived of public housing, it's too soon to tell. So our public housing experiment began with a group of intellectuals, and it continues to play out. It plays out in New York City. This week, at the Stanley Isaacs houses in Yorkville, there's a vote going on. There's similar votes going on all over New York City about whether to change the financing of public housing to bring in private money, private developers to renovate it, and even private management. It's being done all over the country, but in New York, state legislation requires that tenants have to vote up or down on it. At the Throgsneck's houses, the tenants voted no, we're going to stick with NYCHA, because privatization, that means we're going to get kicked out. It's not what it means, but people are scared. In the Isaacs houses, they're voting this week. Should they stay with the status quo, or should they opt for the permanent, affordable, community together packed housing, where a private developer would be authorized to renovate the project and then manage it, even though NYCHA would still own the buildings. It's happened. The Baychester houses in the Bronx, the Edenwald houses in the Bronx underway. It's happened in some places. It's in process for about 64,000 units, not a small number. So it's a promising way to bring renovation, but it's not clear that it will go forward because some people are scared of the P word, privatization. But anyhow, that's a long way of saying the story of public housing continues to play out from the Museum of Modern Art to today in New York City to this week in Yorkville. It's with us in New York. More public housing here than anywhere else. It's a big part of the city, a city within the city, and we have to figure out how to make it work. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm ready for all tomatoes, anything, it's okay.
And anybody has any questions?
Yes, the Oh, okay. Are you going to decide? Okay.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I have a question about Pruitt-Igoe that you spoke at length about, which I appreciated. To my understanding, Pruitt-Igoe had social prerequisites for families to live in Pruitt-Igoe. For example, as far as I know, men couldn't live in Pruitt-Igoe, and to my understanding, that contributed to the degradation of families, nuclear families. And I'm wondering, in your research, if you found any kind of social prerequisites to live in NYCHA in New York.
There was, at the beginning, two income families were the requirement. It was working class housing, lower middle class housing. So NYCHA, Pruitt-Igoe was not, that wasn't the rule, it was effectively the rule. In other words, if you were of low income and you went on public assistance, you couldn't have two incomes. Two incomes would be counted against you and be disqualified from public assistance. So the effect of that was the so-called man in the house rule. They didn't have a rule that no men could be there, but it worked out that way with public assistance around the country. So, I mean, as I'm sure you know, the African-American marriage rate in 1950 was much higher than it is today in the pre-welfare state, if you will, era. So it worked out that way. It wasn't exactly in the rules, but you're not wrong.
Hi, so my name is Ramona, and I am a tenant of public housing. And
Thank
I
you for being
also
here.
run an organization that works nationwide to inform tenants on privatization efforts
Right,
and on the benefits and privileges that we have as public housing tenants.
right.
The description for the program tonight talked about public housing being a failure. And I wanted to understand how you are defining that failure, because in the case of my family, we've been in the same unit for 35 years, which has given us the stability and the continuance for me to make it all the way to the Kennedy School at Harvard, right? Which is a very traditional checkpoint for success. I've made it to the point of earning six figures, working for the FBI and the Department of Defense.
And you continue to live in public
And
housing.
I continue to live in public housing because when I found myself disabled and living below the poverty level, there was nowhere else in New York City that would take me. So I rejoined my household. So there's a couple things that you kind of glossed over, which is in the beginning of public housing, the targets were veterans, working families.
There was veterans housing, but that was not part of public housing. There was veterans housing, that was different, but go ahead.
No, veterans were the preferred tenant for public housing.
Not
And
normally, but okay.
as they moved into public housing and paid low rent, this allowed them to find upward mobility and continue to hold union jobs that led to success. When we were desegregated and Black families started moving in, the federal government then created loans, grants, and subsidies to facilitate white ownership
I agree.
for them to flee public housing.
It's true.
So in 1964, the budget for public housing starts shrinking because it no longer houses white Americans.
Well, it's okay.
And we are talking about a very racist federal government that decided that people of color could be left in place and allowed to be slumified. So I think we need to better understand how you're judging success when federal policy was very dedicated to the idea of starving a public good that continues to be the only housing that is truly affordable, that provides all of its families resources, education, upward mobility, union preference, scholarships, and training that allows us to earn from poverty level all the way up to $120,000, right? So we are not low income. we're a mixed income community, a truly mixed income community, that in spite of the lack of investment has turned public housing into vibrant communities that produce and define the arts and fashion. So if you could just talk about like how you're measuring whether or not we are failing.
Well, I would say this. A lot of the failure to me is the counterfactual. What was happening in poor neighborhoods? People were owning their own houses. They were accumulating wealth. Public housing denied them that opportunity. You can't own your apartment in public housing.
Yes, you can. There is a program under
Well,
Section 9
that may be
to purchase your apartment.
well, that may be a very tiny
When we were
exception.
desegregated, that program was then put on the back burner, and tenants in St. Louis actually led a huge.
I need you to say this into the mic so the live stream.
Okay, sorry. So we're allowed to purchase our units, and that was written into the Section 9 housing code. What happened was that after St. Louis,
I'm unaware of how many NYCHA units are owned by the tenants, but I'm sure it's
no, NYCHA does not allow us to
Thank
go
you.
down that path, but
Yeah.
legally we're entitled to it. And this is one of the things that tenants are looking at as solutions for public housing,
Well,
is this idea of ownership.
Yeah, my view of that would be, I call that lemon capitalism. You get to own a building that's in disrepair. Why did that disrepair happen? Because the idea was not upward mobility for public housing originally. People think that. The idea was going to be a public utility and the maintenance was going to be paid by the rents of working class tenants. That was the theory. That was in the 1937 Act. It was never supposed to be a way station. It was supposed to be the norm. There was going to be more and more of it. Housing was going to be a public utility for all working families. New York did more of that than anybody else. But the idea ultimately clashed with what Americans want, which is to own their own homes. Now, as far as white families being subsidized to go to the suburbs, you're right. Black families being steered into the projects, you're right. There's no doubt about it. And that was wrong, and I denounce it in the book.
Does anybody else have questions? All right, here we go.
Thank you for your presentation. You had mentioned at the end that there's a big concern about private companies coming in to run the projects or NYCHA housing. I'm a former Wall Street analyst. I have deep concerns about that. I've been living in a homeless shelter for over 2 years now. And I think private equity has done a number on this country. We're dealing with this right now with a relative that I'm health proxy for that's staying in a nursing home on the Upper East Side for subacute care following a hospital stay because a private entity is coming in, they're running this place, they're so short-staffed. He spends $900 a day to have his home caregivers there 24/7. I just see when you bring a private entity in, there's not a lot of accountability. We deal with this in the shelter system. A lot of the shelters, many of the shelters are owned by private entities. They've cut the staff back so much. I'm in a MICA shelter, not because I need to be in there for mental illness or chemical addiction, but because I have mobility issues. I'm disabled now. I needed the elevator, and there's no nurse on staff. We can't even eat the food. They have a contract where the food is so bad, people are going to the emergency room all the time. I basically stay in there, and I get a bed and a shower, and they're getting huge sums of money from the government to run these entities, and the people running them at the top are commanding huge salaries. I've heard numbers tossed about $700,000 a year.
If I could just comment, there's not going to be any private equity in NYCHA housing. There's no ownership. NYCHA will continue to own the properties. This is something called the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program. It was initiated by the Obama administration when Sean Donovan, who used to be the housing commissioner for New York, was the HUD secretary. The idea is you convert the Section 9, we heard about Section 9, that's the normal way that operating assistance is funneled from Washington to housing authorities, to Section 8, where every tenant gets a voucher. is voucherized. That allows private management to borrow against this stream of income. And then they renovate the buildings with that income, and then they manage it or they don't manage it. There's a vote going on that could allow NYCHA to continue to management, and carpenters and union plumbers are in favor of that. They want the combination of private investment and ongoing NYCHA ownership. As far as accountability, that becomes NYCHA's role. They have to oversee. If you go to the Baychester houses in the Bronx, which was redeveloped by a private entity, all the tenants have to be approved by NYCHA. So there's no private equity involved. As far as private equity, what you say sounds perilous and upsetting, but it doesn't apply in this case.
That's good to know. Thank you.
The main program that's privatizing public housing is the rental assistance demonstration
Yes.
program. And in order for the units to be inhabited after, the new developer and management company have to force the tenant to sign up for project-based Section 8. And project-based Section 8 is not a voucher that goes to the family.
It varies. It varies. Some of them are portable. The ones in New York are portable.
No, there's no portable Section 8 left in New York City.
In New York City.
The projects that are being privatized are only using project-based Section 8 vouchers.
Right, but they're fixing up the projects.
But that's not the
There's $78 billion of deferred maintenance.
44 billion actually.
Well, it depends how you define it, but look,
No, it's not that it's a
the physical needs there's something called the physical needs assessment, and
physical needs assessment is for 20 years.
okay,
So
that,
that's
that's what
78
NYCHA says.
divided by 20.
Look, what I'm saying is, it's important to be practical. What you may believe, and a lot of people agree, that Washington should have been sending a lot more money for a long time, but that didn't happen, and it's certainly not going to happen under Donald Trump. And so what's the practical way to renovate NYCHA today?
The practical way is to identify revenue streams that can actually fund public housing. And
Identify revenue streams where?
Folks,
Okay, I'm sorry.
we
All right.
can we
We
take
have another question.
we're
from
gonna
somebody
we
who
only
didn't
have
speak.
time for one more, so we're gonna
Okay.
take this final question. But Howard, are you going to be here after the presentation for further questions? Yes,
Of course.
Yes, lovely, wonderful. Let me just get this final question.
Hey, great talk. Thank you so much. I was kind of curious, like, obviously in current day, you know, we have a huge housing problem, and it seems very clear that it's like a supply problem and we need to increase the housing supply drastically. And I've heard lots of takes, like I think, you know, I've heard like 200,000, 500,000, 1 million new houses being built. I was just kind of curious, like, what's your take on like how to improve the housing supply in New York City?
Well, I was a big fan of Mayor Adams' City of Yes. I'm a big fan of 2- and 3-family houses, of 6-unit apartment buildings with stores on the ground floor. See, I'm an acolyte of Jane Jacobs, who I knew a little bit, actually in person, and I'm a big fan of dynamic cities, where people flock on the streets and own stores, and housing has to be part of a dynamic city. And so Adams was kind of returning to that. He wanted to limit the parking requirements so we weren't becoming a city of cars. He wanted to allow for accessory dwelling units, which would fill in the backyards in Queens where there's single-family homes you can fill in. So I think you incrementally fill in the space that's available in the city, and you increase, by increasing the supply, you lower rents overall. That is, okay. If anybody wants to see how that's the case, go to the city of Houston, where the rents are low, the housing prices are low because supply has boomed. If you restrict supply, price will go up. Anyhow.
Thank you.
I just want to say I appreciate the tenant from Mitchell Houses being here and giving me a hard time. I'm glad to take it.
And I would want to echo, you know, I really appreciate the talk. I think more people should learn about public housing. I would hope that others that are looking at the subject would actually speak to the tenants and see why we fight so hard.
Well, there's a lot of interviews with tenants in this book.
Well, Howard is available
Okay.
outside. You can purchase the